Habibi for Hodier, brothers and sisters, welcome to another edition of the African Liberation Media Show. Well, I'm your host, Brother Amos, here with my esteemed elder, Baba Makaru. And tonight we have with us the esteemed scholar and very special guest, Brother Sonjedi Ankh-Ra. How you doing tonight, Brother Sonjedi?
I'm doing excellent. Be before Hodier.
Beat before the 8, brother. Beat before the 8.
Right. Hotep, Alafia, and all the greetings in African languages to everyone. And I look forward to a great discussion. Look forward to learning from y'all, sharing a little bit that, I'll come across and, towards a greater understanding, for our people and to give them tools of understanding. That way we can spread the understanding.
Ashe. Well, just to do a little bit of background on Brother Sonjedi, he's pretty well known in the African Center community. And for those of you who are not familiar with Brother Sonjedi, Brother Sonjedi Ankh-Ra has been teaching Medu Neter, or ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, for 10 years and has been an instructor at the Institute of Kemetic Philology since 2019. So those of you not familiar with the Institute of Kemetic Philology, that is an institute that was started by esteemed scholar Raketi Amin, who is also a linguist and a chematologist. He has been a guest presenter at Temple University's Pan-African Community Education Program, University of Delaware, and a member and presenter at the 2018 and 2019 conferences for the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations, or ASCAC. Sonjedi has also studied Medu Neter from Ankh-Ra, who is the author of Let the Ancestors Speak, and Fadisha Jehudimus Kai Naru, author of Kupigami and Gumi, Spiritual Warriors Are Healers, and The Spirit of the Magi, as well as Sibet Raketi Amin. He is an initiate and royal scribe of the Temple of Anu in Newark, New Jersey, and he has a background in biology from Delaware State University and the College of Health Sciences in San Antonio, Texas. So, brother is well studied, well respected, and I've learned much from him over the years. He also teaches a Medu Neter class that I've had the pleasure of taking. It's a very good experience, and we appreciate you for joining us tonight, good brother.
All right, I'll share.
So the topic of discussion that we're going to deal with tonight is something that is beginning to boil over, not only here amongst us in our discussions as Africans in America, but also amongst Africans in the diaspora and on the continent. I recently just got back from Kemet, or Egypt, and the atmosphere that was present amongst the quote unquote Egyptians there was very different than the last time that I was there. And it's probably been at least 7 years since I've been there. But due to a lot of the recent news and events that have taken place in the news around the ancient Egyptians being Black. And this was something primarily that started back in December of last year. Kevin Hart was scheduled to do a comedy show in Aswan, and they canceled his show because of previous statements that he had made about Egypt being an African civilization. And so this caused a huge uproar and a lot of talk on social media. But more recently, there is going to air a Cleopatra Netflix series that was produced by Jada Pinkett Smith, where she is going to be played by a African woman, and the Arabs and the Egyptians were in uproar over this. In fact, there was an Egyptian lawyer that went on to open up a lawsuit against Netflix for this depiction of Cleopatra as being a Black woman. Now, this is something that we dealt with in a previous video where, we talked about how this was similar to the topic of debate in the early 90s, where they were trying to cherry pick off of Cleopatra and trying to attack what they call Afrocentrism. They were trying to attack it around the premise of Cleopatra not being black. So, you know, there's some scholars in the African descendant community that say she was black. There are many that say that she was not. Most African descendant scholars, true African descendant scholars, will say, you know, why even focus on Cleopatra when you have a long history of African queens that we could point to. But I want to discuss specifically an article that was recently written by Dr. Zahi Hawass, who is the former, he's the former minister of the State of Antiquity Affairs of Egypt. So many people are familiar with Zahi Hawass. Many people are familiar with some of the statements that he's made over the years. But specifically in this article, he was addressing this Cleopatra Netflix series. And here you can see clearly with the title, Cleopatra was not black. There's evidence to suggest that the ancient Egyptian queen Cleopatra had African features. Now, specifically what I want to focus on, and we're going to link this this article in the description so you can go and read it. But specifically, I want to focus on some of the comments that Zahi Hawass made or referenced in this article. Now, this is his writing, so I'm quoting directly from Zahi Hawass himself. But here he says that the Egyptian people are very upset about this Netflix series. We object to the portrayal of Cleopatra as black, much in the way that we would object were she to be represented as blonde. Cleopatra had Mediterranean features. Now, I don't know how much I believe that they would object if she was displayed as blonde, because we've seen many movies depicted on ancient Egypt where Europeans have played the roles of Africans. And there's been no uproar, or there's been no debate from Zahi Hawass or other Arab Egyptians about that. But he goes on to say that no one, even with a little education, can make a film showing Cleopatra as black. But the fact is that in May, a U.S. series will be shown on Netflix, produced by Jada Pinkett Smith, wife of actor Will Smith, and featuring the actress Adele James, that presents Cleopatra in this way. Many African Americans believe that their origins lie in ancient Egypt. If this were true, I would accept it completely, but there's no evidence to prove the theory. Now, if you listen to many of the African descendant scholars who have done vast amounts of work on ancient Kemet, no one has, I won't say no one has claimed, but no one is saying popularly that black people in America derive from ancient Kemet. That has really never been the argument. We know that black people in America who were taken from West Africa, Southern Africa, on what we call the Ma'afa, or what the Europeans call the transatlantic slave trade, and brought here. We know that many of our origins lie in West Africa. What we are saying is that Kemet, or Egypt, is an African civilization. And its history to Africa, as Sheikh Diop said, its history to Africa is the same as the history of Greece is to Europe. So we're not disconnecting Egypt or Kemet from Africa the way the Europeans would like to specifically take Egypt out of Africa and separate the Nile Valley Africans from the rest of the Africans on the continent. Now, I don't know if you brothers want to chime in on that and give a different opinion, but that would be my opinion of how we articulate our connection with ancient Kemet.
Well, I'll go to Elder. Do you want to add something first? Okay. All right. So just really, in a sense, is echoing, what you were saying, what you're saying, Brother Amos, just in my own words, if you will. So being a part of the Kemetic community, which is a subset of the African-centered community, I've not met one person since the 1990s, since I've been involved in this, who actually say we derive directly from Egypt. Nobody. It's more of a cultural kinship. See, for us African people, and cultures that are older are ancestors. You treat a whole culture as an ancestral culture. See, so Kemet is an ancestral culture that shares the same kinship with the other cultures in Africa, and it's because of her antiquity we're able to use those records that they beautifully and blessedly left for us to read. And they knew, and that was the purpose. They even write it in in the tombs why it was even there, for people to read, so that we can use it. It's in the Sabayit text, the text of wise instructions. So looking at these statements by the former minister of state for antiquities affairs of Egypt, Zahi Hawass, he grossly misrepresents, and surprisingly and unsurprisingly has very little knowledge, if any, of African American perspectives. And what perspectives he might have, he would get it from someone who is a misrepresenter of the collective thinking pattern. He's not having this conversation with any of us or any of the most qualified scholars, which more than likely they won't, because they don't want to take that L. And you'll see that none of us we're not trying to take their culture from them. There's no record of any African Americans going over to the Arab Republic of Egypt and saying, we want to take this from you, you get out. No. So we can dead that right there. And as far as the bots that's on the internet, on social medias, not one of them could quote any of us saying anything like that. We honor the inhabitants of all African countries, including Egypt. All the indigenous inhabitants, we are all kinfolk, and we treat them as such. So shame on Zahi Hawass for his unscholastic claims.
Now he goes on to say that in the U.S. a few years ago, I went to Philadelphia in the U.S. to give a lecture at the University of Pennsylvania. The lecture was sold out, and the main question on the program was about the origins of the ancient Egyptians. I said there were three opinions. The first says that the ancient Egyptians were Semitic and Hamitic people, meaning that they came both from Asia and Africa. This evidence is the color of the people of the Delta, who are Mediterranean, and the people of Upper Egypt, who are much darker. The grammar of the hieroglyphic script is similar to Arabic and Hebrew. He goes on to say the second opinion is associated with Sheikh Dejop from Senegal, who said that the origins of the ancient Egyptians were in Africa. He produced a statue of Tutankhamun and Ramses II, showing them to be black. He also said that the grammar of the hieroglyphics was similar to some African languages. However, at a UNESCO conference in Paris held to examine this theory, it was found that there is no evidence to support it. Then he goes on to say that the third opinion is based on excavations at Nakada in Upper Egypt by Sir Flinders Petrie, a father of Egyptology. Petrie excavated a pre-dynastic cemetery there and said that the people who were buried in it were the people who made the ancient Egyptian civilization. So finally, he says that his conclusion is, looking further afield at ancient Asia and Africa, it is clear that the pharaonic civilization occurred only in Egypt, that people who created the civilization came out of Egypt, and as they watched the sun rise and set and rise again, they formed their own beliefs about the afterlife. This was the reason they began to build tombs in the shape of pyramids and temples. Now, in reading this statement, it seems to me that Zahi Hawass really contradicts himself, because in one essence, he's disagreeing with Sheikh Dejop's opinion, saying that the Egyptians are Africans, or that the Egyptians did not come from Asia or from Europe. And here he's saying the same thing. But it's hard for Zahi Hawass to say that the Egyptians are Africans. So he'll separate Egypt from Africa by making statements that we'll show later in the presentation, because I'm getting ready to pass it over to Brother Sonjedi, because I want you just to address what he said about the Medu Neter being close to Arabic and Hebrew. He'll make statements where he's showing depictions of people on the temple of Ramesu, or Ramses II, as he calls him. And he's saying that Ramses is smiting his enemies. And in that statement, he says that here you see depicted Egyptians, you see 4 Africans, Libyans, and then you also see Mediterranean people. Now, he names 2 countries in Africa, but doesn't want to associate those people with being African. So I thought that that was, very, very telling of the contradictions in his statements and the racial undertones in a lot of the statements that he makes. And we'll get into a lot of his other statements, but I want to pass it over to you, Brother Sonjedi, because I know that you've done a lot of research in the field of linguistics and Medu Neter. And I want you to talk to us a little bit about what Zahi Hawass is referring to in his statement about Medu Neter being closely related to Arabic and Hebrew.
All right. So before I go there, okay, so you can see I pulled this off the shelf, African Origin of Civilization by Sheikh Diop, translated by Mercer Cook, in which it's based on his earlier classical work, Nations Negro-Egyptian Culture. So you have this work here, which we all should have, this, and then portions of this was translated into this here. So these go together. All right. So some of his statements, let's just say this. So when you get this book, you go to chapter 3, he talks about the modern falsification history, so some of which Zahi Hawass is espousing. So he addresses that. And what you want to know about this text is that Sheikh Diop, this great ancestor, Ma'akaru, he's addressing the scholars and the PhDs. That's who he's addressing them. Okay. Then we'll go to chapter 4. Could Egyptian civilization have originated in the Delta? And in chapter 5, could Egyptian civilization be of African origin? Both of these chapters end in question mark, have question marks in the title. So the whole thing of the whole thing of Zahi Hawass saying, oh, the Egyptians, they basically came out of the soil where they were. No. Okay. And many of the artifacts that they say, and again, this is a point that Sheikh Diop is bringing up. The artifacts that they'll say is that's pre-dynastic, and they say, oh, this stuff is associated with Asia. They usually find them in southern Kemet. Let me say it again. They'll find it in southern or upper Kemet, away from the Delta, away from the northern region. They find it in the south, but they'll say that it's characteristically northern Kemet in the Delta. So he points out how they'll manipulate our perception of the data. So they got the data. So always study Egyptology. A huge bulk of information is there for us to read. It's you interpreting the implications of the data. This is where we have to be African centered and have proper guides on knowing how to categorize the data. So Sheikh Diop, one of the reasons why he was such, say, a threat to them is because he could battle them on the scholastic PhD level, where to them, well, those who don't have that, they don't qualify according to them. But he has the training and he knows all the nuances and how PhDs make arguments, and he cut through all of that, and he did in his text here. So there is no Asian origin of the Kemetic civilization. Right? That's already been demonstrated. So it's the younger generation, us. We have to carry that torch forward. So although they've done the work, Sheikh Anta, his students, those who follow him, we call it the Diopian school in general. Those who follow in his example, the Diopian school. So him and the great elder scholar Theophilus Benga and many others have already defeated them, but they want you to forget that defeat. So if you can forget that defeat, then they can come back and try to repeat history, if you will. But we shall not forget. So this presentation that I'm going to give, it's basically surface cliff notes, if you will. These are my notes. We're going to talk about the contents of Jean-Claude Mboli's work. We're going to talk about Sheikh Anta Diop's linguistic work. We're going to talk about Theophilus Benga's linguistic work. Just simply introductions of what their texts are about, what their approach is, and then, you know, hopefully in the near future we can come back and we can get heavier into more linguistic specifics and the glyphs and things like that hit hard. But today we want to give you a general format. All right, so let's go ahead and do. Did you have anything, Elder? Okay. All right. Okay. Let me know if you can see the screen because I can't see you.
Yep.
Okay,
yep,
you can
see it.
All right. All right, everyone. So selective notes on Mboli's book, Origin of African Civilizations. Now, this 2010 text was originally written in French. It is currently in the process of being translated into English. So this is Brother Mboli, Jean-Claude Mboli. And this is the cover. Definitely recommend everyone gets this, whether you can read French or not. You want to have the text. The application test of the comparative method to ancient and modern African languages. So what is the importance of this text? Jean-Claude Mboli, he's an engineer, which means he already thinks in detail. He thinks in patterns. And the only thing that matters in science is what can be demonstrated. Your opinion, your feelings is not the determining factor in the data. Using the scientific method, things can be proven mathematically, and things can be demonstrated linguistically and other methods. And he is in that line of those scholars from Sheikh Anta Diop coming up. And we know that when we go to Civilization of Barbarism, that great text by Sheikh Anta Diop, he gives us a model, a pathway on how to approach the research. We want to have a linguistic factor, there's the psychological factor, historical factor, etc. So we use the linguistics as a tool to help us demonstrate the already established connections between African cultures and civilizations. So when you go into the language, then it's harder for you to say these things are not related. Because when you share common words, especially basic words for water, words for, say, heart, person, human, man, woman, earth, ritual, ceremonies, you share the same names of deities, etc., then that also means you share a common psychology, because words carry a psychology. Words always carry the spirit of its origin. Let me say that again. Words will always carry the spirit of its origin. So when languages are related, they share a common what? Mother tongue, which also means they share a common culture, which means deep down they share a common history, which also means they share a common psychology. which also means that they run their societies in a similar fashion. They run their societies with similar spiritual values, which will then reflect into their rituals and ceremonies, etc. And we can trace this like a forensic scientist. So on the left, you see these are the names of the chapters. I translated it from French to English. So there's 3 parts to the text. Part 1, 2, and 3. So part 1, he gives a general introduction, telling us, okay, why this text is being written. Some of the issues, that take place that makes this text necessary. The issues and challenges of the previous scholars and the antagonists. He speaks about the pre-Greenbergian period. Many of you who may not know that there was a linguist by practice, not by training, Joseph Greenberg. He was writing in the early mid 1900s, and in the 1960s, he published a book on African languages in which he did what's called a mass comparison. So in that mass comparison of African languages into these categories was basically hogwash, if you will. Okay? He slapped it together on surface features. So number 1, you have this language family called Afro-Asiatic. Now, Afro-Asiatic first appears in French, Afro-Asiatique. And pardon my pronunciation, I'm not a native French speaker, but Afro-Asiatic being used is rooted in racism, is rooted in what's called the Hamitic myth. The Hamitic myth. I'll speak about that in a second. So before Greenberg, you had different linguists, and it's not a lot of them, who were doing these categories for African languages. So you go to 1700s, 1800s, and these people were racist. They looked at African people as subhuman. So because of that, they're bringing these biases into the research, which invalidates much of their claims. And when you really read some of what they're saying, it completely blows your mind on the racism. So that's pre-Greenbergian period. So you have the different linguists who are racist, who are making these surface claims about African languages and people. Now, Greenberg, mass comparison. Mass comparison is when, again, you're using surface features. So think about it like this. If you have 10 Black men in a room and you look at them and say, all right, I think that all of them are related. They must come from the same parent because all 10 of them have woolly hair. They're brown to dark skin. All of them have 10 fingers. All of them have a nose and all of them have eyes. Therefore, they have the same mother and father. All right. Now, does that make sense, y'all? As something to make a conclusion about? No. Or do you ask each of them, who's your mother and who's your father? Okay. Maybe 3 of you have the same mother and father. You look at the genotype. You have genotype and phenotype. The genotype is where you're actually doing a DNA test. So you do a DNA test to see, you ask them also, okay, what's your family tree? Who's your biological mother? Who's your biological father? Where did you live at? Where did you grow up? All these questions. So you're doing what? Psychological factor, you're doing a scientific factor, linguistic factor, all these things. So now when we go to part 2, what's called the comparative method in African languages. The comparative method is like asking, who is your mother and father? Biologically, did you grow up in the same household? Do you have the same values? Did you learn the same thing, etc.? as opposed to, oh, there's 10 black guys here. All y'all look the same, so all of y'all come from the same place. Where all 10 of them could have come from 10 different countries and have absolutely nothing to do with each other. That's the Greenberg method. Or you can use the comparative method and ask these questions and actually do research on what these languages are about and what the origin is. So the comparative method is where you are systematically testing the history of a language. You're testing the meanings, you're testing cognates, etc., and you're being really rigorous. Now, at the end of this presentation, I'm going to give you a reference video for you to go into further detail. All right. So continuing in part 2. So the languages of comparison. So he goes into specific languages. So we have Middle Egyptian, which we'll say Medu Neter, if you will, but Middle Egyptian. He'll use Coptic, Sango, Zande, and Hausa. So these are his test languages. And Mboli is consistent. He uses the test languages of Middle Egyptian, Coptic, Sango, Zande. Both Sango, Zande are in the central regions of Africa. We already know where Middle Egyptian and Coptic is spoken. We have Hausa. Okay. We know Hausa, we have, that's like in Nigeria. So we have these languages that he tests consistently, systematically, well organized. After that, he goes into phonetic correspondences. So what are these sound correlations? So this is what we talk about when we say phonetic. And then morphological correspondences. How do the words form? Like with prefixes, root words, suffixes, etc. Are those changes consistent? Do they correlate? Do the changes correlate across the board with these these test languages? And it does. He demonstrates it. Part 3, lexicological correspondences. So now we're talking about whole words that correlate together. So he has a whole list, shows the Medu Neter, and then he shows the translations, etc. Then he shows the other languages. New Negro-Egyptian languages. So Negro-Egyptian, we'll get into that in a second. That's a language family. So based on this new data, not necessarily new data, but rearranged and more systematically categorized, now we make new categories, but in a more organized fashion. And then, of course, he talks about contact issues and then general conclusion. So definitely get this text. It's well organized, and he does presentations mostly in French. He's done 1 or 2 in English because he speaks like 5 different languages. This man is a genius. Okay. So here's one of the things he says. He tells us on page 451. He says, we have chosen to demonstrate the belonging to the Negro-Egyptian of 8 Negro-African families. So mind you, when we say Negro-Egyptian, he's talking about a language family. These are the languages that we can relate to ancient Egyptian or Kemetic. That's been demonstrated. Okay. Swahili or Kiswahili, Lingala, Baya, Banda, Wolof, Bambara, Nuer, Zerma. Zerma, that's a language, a dialect of Songhai. So many of us have heard of the Songhai Empire, rooted in, that was centered in Mali centuries ago. Nuer, we find that in modern day Sudan. So the first 6 languages were classified in the family Niger-Congo. So again, Niger-Congo is a category created by Joseph Greenberg. Keep that in mind. By comparative Africanists. And this on criteria that would make any novice comparative smile. So he's just saying that when you look at it, we feel satisfied. But now he goes on. He says the last 2 belong to the other large family of typically Negro languages in the sense of Africanus. So he's saying these are still categories that they created, namely of Nilo-Saharan. So Nilo-Saharan is another family created by Greenberg, or categorized by Joseph Greenberg. Swahili, Lingala, two Bantu languages, as well as Wolof, and we all know about Wolof, can already be considered as belonging to the Negro-Egyptian because of the comparative studies carried out by Debunking, comparison of another Bantu language, Mbochi, with Middle Egyptian, and Sheketa-Jop, comparison of Wolof with Middle Egyptian. However, it seemed to us necessary to compare them in a large context in order to learn more about Proto-Bantu. Okay, now what does all this mean? So let's look at this here. So Sheketa-Jop, again, we're going to go through this again in this classical text here. Proto génétique et l'Égyptien fourni et des langues Negro-Africaines. So part of my pronunciation. So we're talking about the relationship of Pharaonic Egyptian and Black African languages, 1977. And in this text, he demonstrates the relationship between what we call the Middle Egyptian and Wolof. He has a whole dictionary, even in the back, after he's made his arguments between Egyptian and Wolof. Okay. So that's what Mboli is referring to. He's referring to this text here. And then with Mbochi, which is spoken in Democratic Republic of Congo, he's speaking about this 1993 classical text by the Father Bank. All right. And case in point, look. So you have Niger Congo, you have Nile Saharan. Many don't know that Nile Saharan is the junk file of Joseph Greenberg. So when Joseph Greenberg was categorizing languages, you have Niger Congo, you have Afro-Asiatic, you also have Khoisan. The languages that he was not able to categorize anywhere, he just threw it in the junk file and called it Nile Saharan. That's what that is. As much as we might be intrigued by the name, but the process is no good. It's a junk file. All right. This is what Sheketa-Jop tells us. He says, the process of the evolution of African languages appears clear. Far from us the idea that the Wolof descends by direct descent from the ancient Egyptian, but Wolof, Egyptian, and other African languages derive from a common mother tongue, which one can call Paleo-African, Common African, or Negro-African of Lillian Homburger or Theophilo Benga. In this way, the previous state of one of these languages can shed light on even the current forms of the language family. Likewise, the comparison of the lexicons of several of these languages makes it possible to eliminate the false etymologies. All right. In other words, it was posited by Lillian Homburger, so it says L. Homburger, who was Sheketa-Jop's linguistic teacher in Paris. She had did a work called The Negro-African Languages, 1930s, 1940s. It was published in French originally and then translated into English. She noticed that Middle Egyptian or Egyptian or Kemetic have similar word forms as these languages in West Central and South Africa. So she was noticing these things. She sees the data, but her interpretation of the data, she says the reason why you have these relationships is because the Egyptians, when they left Egypt, conquered these other Africans, and that's how the language got there. That is her explanatory model of the data. Well, Sheketa-Jop's explanation of that data is that they come from a common parent. That's why they're related, not because Egyptians went throughout Africa and conquered them, is that they have the same mother tongue. That's why. And we could demonstrate this. So he took his native language, which is Wolof, coming out of Senegal, and he demonstrated that it's related to Egyptian. Now, what is the importance of this? Why does this matter? Because Joseph Greenberg put together these false categories that Theophilo Benga, in his work, Ancient Egypt and Black Africa, he calls it a fraud in this book here, because Greenberg used this mass comparison. So think about that example we discussed earlier. He just slapped it together. So you have Niger Congo, you have Afro-Asiatic. They're not related according to Joseph Greenberg and those who follow him. Well, if I take Wolof from here, which is Niger Congo, and I take Middle Egyptian from here, which is Afro-Asiatic, and I can demonstrate that these two languages have the same mother tongue, that means that these two categories are false. Just by doing that, Diop destroyed the entire premise of Joseph Greenberg, just with that.
Mm-hmm.
Let's move on. I know there's another point I wanted to make here. Oh, here's another kissing point. Afro-Asiatic. First off, Afro-Asiatic, the phrase, is a secularization of the phrase Hamido-Semitic. It comes from the same philosophy or thinking pattern, because Joseph Greenberg and others who espouse Afro-Asiatic, they believe that Ethiopians and Hausa people, Kemetic people, are dark-skinned Caucasians because they couldn't deal with the Africanity of these people, that they are Africans. So they call them dark-skinned Caucasians, and they conquered the Negroes. Mm-hmm. That's Joseph Greenberg's belief, and those who follow him. So Hamido, the Hamite people, the Egyptians, etc., and others. So all the Africans, they're Hamites by default. And then Semitic people, you have the Semitic speakers. But this is based on chapter 10 of the book of Genesis, on the table of nations. You cannot use the Bible to make scientific inquiry and conclusions. So when you hear Afro-Asiatic, Afro-Asiatic comes from Hamido-Semitic, which is rooted in the Hamitic myth, which says that African people are cursed from the time of Noah, and Ham, according to them, did some diabolical things to his father, thus he was cursed, etc. You know, our skin became black, hair woolly, eyes red, and elongated members, elongated penises. Okay, they say that's a curse. So that says that you have some other groups of men who are insecure about their manhood. Again, not my opinion, that's what they wrote. So this is what they were fighting against. All right, so this diagram is just a visual of what Sheikh Anta is saying, that in this region in Africa, over here, this is the origin of civilization right here. And this we already know. Even when you go further, a little further south into the Great Lakes region, homage to Dickenesh, etc. Even languages coming out of South Africa, you have Khoisan down there, which is oldest, the oldest living languages we have. But I'm going to put it here, Paleo-African. You see, it's the same origin. Rodney Kemet, which is a way of saying language of Kemet or languages of Kemet, that's another conversation. Wolof, they have the same parent tongue. Diop says that Wolof, and again, this is a repeat, Wolof Egyptian and other African languages derive from a common mother tongue, which one can call Paleo-African. All right, and we want to revisit that towards the end. Obenga later tells us that for Wolof, Sheikh Anta has wonderfully analyzed the essential facts in Parente, Parent. So that's his text. Diop's text we just discussed. As far as the comparative and the superlative are concerned, the identity between Egyptian and Wolof structures is rigorously established. So it's established. Okay. Keep going. All right, I'm gonna have to read this, y'all. So in this text here, 1993, the common origin of ancient Egyptian, Coptic, and modern Black African languages. Introduction to African historical linguistics. So this is his comment on page 42. It says, it is clear that the vocalization of the Pharaonic Egyptian must normally start from Coptic. All right, so this is his stance, which is from Egyptian in the very first place. Consideration of the Semitic in this problem is a real philological nonsense, okay? As if one wanted to vocalize an ancient state of Berber from Phoenician or Calabrian. Next, the strictly linguistic context of Negro-African languages must be considered. So there are Negro-African languages which still appear today as archaic Egyptian. So what he's saying is that you have African languages, especially Bantu languages, that preserve older forms that existed from the old kingdom, if you will. There's still words from the old kingdom that are preserved that people still use these words today in their spoken language. All right, so this is the case of Wolof, for example, according to the meticulous research of Sheket Tajok. So in short, efforts must be directed towards African languages, not towards Semitic languages, since Egyptian is an African language, like Wolof or Zulu. Be that as it may, we have a state of vocalized Egyptian, which is Coptic. So what you're saying is that Coptic today, it has many of the vowels from, and we're going to say one of the languages from Kemet. Again, we can talk about that a little further on. So, and Coptic shows that the Pharaonic was also vocalized in any case vocalizable. That the Pharaonic had also dialectical variants like Coptic. So that's to say that the Coptic dialects are not born from nothing. So since in principle, all these Coptic dialects will continue the Pharaonic, that the Egyptologists, they refuse to consider Coptic as an essential language for vocalization. So we know anyone who's taken Medu Neter know that when you look into the books, you usually see a lot of E's between, the consonants, because the Egyptologists, they're basically just slapping them in there. Although they will use a little Coptic like Hotep. So you put the O there, that actually comes from Coptic. We say Hotep. Right? So, and then at the bottom, he recognizes the Cairo Symposium, UNESCO in 1974. And that this direction that Diop and him have taken, we have to continue that. All right. So this is a family tree of archaic Negro-Egyptian. So this comes right out of Jean-Claude Mboli's book. So of course he writes it in French, but here, this is an English translation. This comes from his presentation. He gave me special permission to use one of his slides. He has some other ones, but I wasn't able to get permission. So out of integrity, I'm not going to try to use them. So here, Mboli, he reanalyzed the data that's found by Theophilo Benga. So in the back of Theophilo Benga's book, he rearranges the language groups from Joseph Greenberg. So Joseph Greenberg, he puts these categories together. So you have, remember, you have Niger Congo, Nilo-Saharan, you have Khoisan, and you have Afro-Asiatic. Obenga, what he does is he says that Semitic is not related to Egyptian directly. So he takes that out, and he takes out Berber. And Obenga says that Berber, or Berber, if you will, they say the language is Tamazight. So Tamazight is the indigenous term for what we're calling Berber languages, so as to give them their agency and respect. So Tamazight languages and Semitic is separate from the so-called Afro-Asiatic. Of course, he dismantled that, him and Diop, and that what we're calling Egyptian, Niger-Congo, and Nilo-Saharan is actually one group. Niger-Congo, Nilo-Saharan, and Egyptian is one family that Obinga calls Negro-Egyptian, the language family. Okay, and then Berber is its own group, and then you have Khoisan, which is its own. Semitic, according to the latest research, was formulated Proto-Semitic in Western Asia. It was not formed in Africa. So although we have old forms of Semitic or Ethio-Semitic in Ethiopia, we do have that. That's already established fact. But Semitic entered into Ethiopia via the Arabian Peninsula. Semitic was formed in Western Asia. All the research demonstrates it. Obinga, that was his position, and the latest researchers by linguists, same thing. All right. So the issue with that, as pointed out by Brother Asar Imhotep, is that, well, we know the racism of the Egyptologists and of the linguists when it comes to Kemet and other African civilizations, when it comes to those languages. So they use racism. So we know that we can't use race as a criteria for scientific conclusions, inquiry, and process. So we can't then use it too. So Obinga used the term Negro-Egyptian, Negro being a what? A racial designation. But we understand the point that he was making. The point that he was making is, hey, listen, you're saying that Egyptians are white people. No, they are African people. So I'm going to just go ahead and say Negro-Egyptian to put the stamp on it so that there's no confusion about what we're talking about here. So that was, that was the point of him naming this language family Negro-Egyptian. So it was more, political. So Jean-Claude Mboli starts from scratch because no one has done it before. Because with Theophile Obinga, he takes existing categories by Joseph Greenberg and just rearranges them instead of starting from scratch. So he did take us a step further, but now we have to take the next step here. So the next step is, let's start from scratch. We have the data. We have the work of Sheikh Tajot. We have the data by Theophile Obinga. We have data by Kipshuat Sambo. We have data by Muba Bengi Bilolo. We have data by these other scholars. We have this data. So we can take it to the next step. So start from scratch, make the rearrangement based on organization. So at the top there, you see what's called Archaic Negro-Egyptian. So this is the ultimate, this is the grandmother tongue, if you will, Archaic Negro-Egyptian. The CV, that represents consonant vowel. And from there, when we go to ancient Africa, the earliest speakers of language, because we already know that the first people to have a language are who? African people. So that's what's called Archaic Negro-Egyptian. And then you have these branches. So 3 branches where you have these accentuations or emphasis on vowels and consonants. And you have what's called determined and determinate. If you look at branch 1 and 2, you'll notice that the term determined and determinate are flipped, if you will, which gives it its characteristics. So sounds that are that determine and sounds that are the determinant. And then from there, you see the groups are called Kweki and Kikwe and Kikuki. These are based on sounds of African languages. That is the power of Mboli's model here. He's using the sounds of African languages to categorize African languages. And we can look at this as essentially an Afrocentric model, if you will, because you're giving agency to African phenomena. So you notice that Kweki and Kikwe, the sounds Kwe and Ki are flipped. Again, that's about the determined and determinate. And remember, the CVs, This is the consonants and vowels. And you can see the algebra appearing formulas, because again, they're using math type formulas to make determinations. This is the rigor of the work that has to be done. Well, that has been done and continues to be done. This is who you want to listen to, who you want to reference. People are putting in this kind of work. Now, you can see another box that says post-classic Negro-Egyptian. And you see the 3 arrows going to that box. This is about Africans, people throughout large regions of the continent who are mixing together, who are networking together for such long periods of time that these languages become mutually intelligible. So that's what's called post-classic Negro-Egyptian. And the term that he uses is bere. So bere, he's using that word as a template to show how the words are behaving. Like words have personalities, if you will. So the longer these languages are overlapping, or these groups, this Kikwe and Kweki group is overlapping, eventually you get dialects. All this is occurring in Africa. So you have what's called a Bere dialect and a Beir dialect. Notice they have the same sounds, but the last 2 is flipped. So you have the R and E, consonant, vowel, and then it flips. And in the Bere group, you have Hausa, Zande, Middle Egyptian, and others under that. These are just 3 examples I could fit on the screen. And then the Beir group dialect is Coptic, Sango, and Somali. So the data, he discovered that Middle Egyptian Coptic are 2 different languages, but that's after he did the work. Now, yes, that is different from what we have learned, but follow the data. Remember, it's still an African language. Coptic is still an African language. You know, we've had many who have had a negative response to this. But however, this is an African researcher, a follower of Diop's work, who started from scratch. And yes, we're going to get new data. It's still an African language. We never said that Coptic is not related to Egyptian. Okay, it's a relationship like Hebrew and Arabic, if you will. Okay, or Spanish and French. Okay. All right, let's keep going. All right, so this is a diagram out of his book. Okay, so the genealogical tree of post-classic Negro-Egyptian. So he just goes to a little bit more detail here. So between the Be'er and Bere and how the consonants and vowels are behaving. So you see just a little bit more detail there. So that's figure 831.
Could I ask a question?
Yes, sir.
Bro, yeah. So in terms of why we are doing this, based on the statement that almost read in the beginning, you are doing this, but we want to make sure that people understand why we are doing this. In terms of Hawass saying that the grammar of the hieroglyphics is similar to Arabic and Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
And what you are explaining is that it's not. But, you know, I just want the people to understand how you're explaining how it's not. But, you know, just for like, say, a person that's not, you know, deep into linguistics, you know, such as myself, you know, how do I say, like, take this in a, say, like, if I want to go on into the article that Hawass wrote and say, you know, what you just said about this, the grammar being similar to Hebrew and Arabic is not true. Now, because you use the term Semitic languages, and I'm assuming when you're saying Semitic languages, you're speaking, you know, about the languages of, you know, the Hebrews and the Arabs and whatnot. But I just want to make sure that we explain to people, you know, this is the reason why we're doing this, because the whole African-centered movement, which is based on the African origin of civilization, you know, has, you know, been under attack, you know, since the 1990s, and now we see a resurgence of that attack by people who are largely ignorant of the history. Yeah. Am I making the point?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, sir. So all this, and I know it seems a lot, and that's just why I'm only just doing quick diagrams, because we definitely have to do a part 2 with more examples. But we're showing this is the detail of work that African scholars are doing. That you can't dismiss this. That they're doing work on a level that, of course, the masses may not be aware, you are not aware of, that we're making sure we're constantly exposing our people to, showing this is the type of detail that we're doing.
Right.
That, and this, and at the end of this, you see this is the reason why they refuse to have open dialogue with us, because they got to deal with this.
Right.
And they can't deal with this level.
Right.
Because they already know they're going to lose.
Right. Okay. Now, one other thing. Okay. So the other statement that almost read when he was giving Hawass's explanations, he said, the second opinion is associated with Sheikh Anta from Senegal, who said that the origins of the ancient Egyptians were in Africa. He produced the statue blank, blank, blank. He also said that the grammar of the hieroglyphics is similar to some African languages. This is the point I want you to respond to. However, at a UNESCO conference in Paris, he doesn't say when this conference took place or whatever. He just says at a UNESCO conference in Paris held to examine this theory, it was found that there was no evidence to support it.
I have to laugh at that. So when you go to the text, the General History of Africa, by UNESCO, Volume 2, around around 40, around there, Sheikh Anta has an article there where, of course, he discusses the term Kemet as meaning black. Of course, there's some updates that we were doing with that term recently.
Right.
But they read that with the reworking of the definition. Not that we made it up. We just use evidence. Okay. We follow the evidence despite people's feelings. Okay. Remember, we can't get into people's feelings about it. Okay. So the evidence demonstrates that the term Kemet actually means riparian land. Okay. But the data also took us to another level. So we also learned that the term Kemet is all over Africa. Terms like Congo, Uganda come from the same origin as the word Kemet. But we would have never done it if we just only stuck to the definition as the black land,
right,
or land of the black people. Okay? Now, we understand that has carried us forward, but then we go back and we reassess, because Sheikh Anta was a scientist. You honor the scientists by re-examining their work. Okay. So yes, we got a lot of pushback, a lot of emotional responses by it. Different relationships were compromised because of it. But if we're putting together the history of African people and fighting people like Zahi Hawass, then you can't mix your emotions in the data, because that's what they do. Okay. Think about this, Elder. This is how I approach things. If I am in a room, in a conference, and there's 100 people in the audience, every single one of them are linguists, Egyptologists, historians, and every single one of them want to dismantle the fact of the African origin, the Africanity, African character, and the pure Africanness of Kemet. Every single one of them. And I'm standing on the stage, and they're ready to. They read all of Sheikh Anta Diop's books. They read everything I may have written, and they're ready. They got the books and they're ready to tear it apart. What do you do? I got to know Medu Neter. I got to know how to make the arguments, counter arguments, because they're coming from me. That's how I'm preparing my brain. And I'm always thinking about the counter arguments. So if I go into Sheikh the Job's classical work here, okay, a very respectable work. Remember, Sheikh the Job was a human being like everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
So he's made mistakes. Okay. And it's okay. This is not blasphemy. Okay. Because, and again, respect to people who are religious or Christian, I would say. Meantime, we're acting like Christians who, when you say, well, Jesus was black, and then, oh my gosh, that's how people responded to the Kemet debate. Okay. It's okay, brothers and sisters. Kemet is an African civilization. They treat us as if we said that Kemet is not an African civilization. They were African people. They were dark-skinned people, most of them. Okay. It's okay. All right. So, but what if a linguist went into this book, I believe chapter 5? It's chapter 5. Yes. Yep. Chapter 5 of this work, expressions et termes particular. So, expressions of particular terms. Okay. Chapter 5, starting on page 92. If a linguist went here and they'll say, well, you didn't use the comparative method, you were not rigorous, they would not be lying. I'm sorry. Okay. He did a comparison, but it was not rigorous. So someone could come in and dismantle it. So how about we, African people, let's do it beforehand. When you go into the Kemetic text in instructions of Merikare, or the instructions to Merikare by his father Keti, he says, correct yourself lest another one correct you. Let me say it again. Correct yourself, otherwise another person will correct you. That's from the Kemetic text, since many of us believe in African literature and African philosophy, so let's use it. So we critique ourselves, okay? So that we can move forward and not get defeated and not put our feelings into it.
So essentially, I didn't mean to cut you off, brother, but just essentially what you're saying in referencing that whatever UNESCO conference that Zahi Hawass is referencing in this article, they're looking at the methodology of Sheikh Anta Diop, and from a linguistic standpoint, they were saying that it was not rigorous enough for it to be conclusive.
So when you read about the minutes or the occurrences of that conference, the Cairo Symposium. So this is what I believe that Zahi Hawass is referring to. Okay, 1974. In the occurrences, while Diop was discussing some of the linguistics, it was a counter argument, being that Obinga is more the linguist, more so than Diop was.
Yep.
It appears that Obinga, he picked up on that and was able to basically intervene and essentially save Diop from getting pulled into a hole. And he did respectfully, because remember, Diop is the elder. So he saw it and was like, oh, wait a minute. He cuts in and was able to recenter the conversation. So that's part a lot of people don't know about. And remember, even watch this. If saying Diop was incorrect about something is blasphemy, then you have to then say, well, that means Obinga's blasphemous, because he never Obinga never defines Kemet as land of the blacks. Never. Okay, it doesn't mean that Diop is less important. Diop is our foundation, no matter what. And it's okay if he might have been off on some things. Some, not all. But Obinga calls it the black land, referring more so to like soil. But he doesn't call it land of the Negroes. He does not do that. Okay? So, and of course, there's some others who critique Diop as well, but it's mostly in French. Okay. All right. Did you have anything before I continue? Or?
No.
Okay.
All Go right. ahead.
So those two branches, he discusses you know, where like the epicenters. So you have epicenter here in Sudan, you have epicenter down here close to the Great Lakes region, etc., and the migrations of these speakers. He does it here as well. Here's another epicenter and another epicenter here. Okay, all right. So our brother Asar Imhotep, who is more of a subject matter expert, especially on Mboli's model. Recommend you get this book, Shin Into Religion and Philosophy, Volume 2. Chapter 9 of this text is where he goes into the linguistics in detail. Now watch this. You know how we said that the language family is called Negro-Egyptian. So here's some upgrades that Asar Imhotep did. So on the left is just a general chart showing a process. But on the left, on the right, you have Shinkanda Shikulu, meaning archaic African. He's using the Shiluba language. Shiluba, which is a Bantu language out of the Congo. And remember, we're using African languages to describe and label African phenomena. So Shikulu means archaic, ancient, primitive. Shinkanda is like saying African and is cognate, watch this, with the word Kemet. Okay, so Shinkanda Shikulu essentially means what Diop calls like Paleo-African or Proto-African. And then at the bottom, you have Shi and Into, which means originating from Into, which is related to Ba Into or Bantu. That, and this is a phrase picked up from Mubabengi Bilolo. So over here, this Shinkanda Shikulu, that's like saying archaic Negro-Egyptian, classic Shinkanda, it's like saying post-classic, Shin Into Egyptian, Bantu, Yoruba. Okay. And then right here, I'm saying that Shinkanda Shikulu essentially is a Shiluba translation of Diop's Paleo-African. So the update is still honoring Sheikh Anta Diop in his original premise, mainly in the name, and we continued the work. Highly recommend you go to YouTube, you type in Alluja Volume 2, Lesson 4, Negro-Egyptian or Shina Into explained by Asar Imhotep. He goes into history, he goes into good detail, etc. So I highly recommend you go to this channel, look at that lesson, look at it a few times, and purchase the book. Purchase all these books. All right. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop the share.
All right, brother. I appreciate you for sharing that detail, specifically based around why Zahi Hawass was able to reference that UNESCO conference, even though he didn't give the exact date for the conference or talk about which conference it is. We're assuming it's the conference that you referenced, where you mentioned Theophile Obenga having to clarify the method that Sheikh Anta was using when in response to Kemet and the Medu Neter being an African language, and African languages, several African languages being related or coming from the same central source, Paleo-African, as you mentioned by Sheikh Anta. So when we look at Zahi Hawass's statement, he also mentioned that it was closer to Hebrew and close to Hebrew and Arabic. Can you talk about what Arabic he's referring to?
Yes.
Because a lot of people get confused around different types of Arabic that are spoken. So can you talk a little bit about what he may be referring to in that aspect?
So again, going back to Diop, where he talks about the in his text, civilization and barbarism, the historical factor. So historical factor demonstrates to us that the Arabs coming out of Saudi Arabia, who were Muslims, were spreading across up to Baghdad, across North Africa, etc. Now, the varieties of Arabic in these regions would take on a character of those people. So if I go to Morocco, you have what's called Moroccan Arabic, Tunisian Arabic, which they would have words in those varieties from Tamazight languages, or what we're calling Berber languages, because of the people who are there. If I go to, let's say, Iraq, based on the people that's there, they're going to have words from the people who were already there. If you keep going east, where people were speaking like the Persian language or languages, if you will, in dialects, they will have those words in the Arabic in those regions. So when you go to Egypt, you have what's called Egyptian Arabic. So Egyptian Arabic is writing Arabic that has native Kemetic terms in it. So that's why if he was standing next to me and he said that, I would say, are you talking about Quranic Arabic, which they refer to as modern standardized Arabic, which is based on the Arabic out of the Quran? Because if I do the Arabic out of the Quran and I take that and say, well, let me compare that to, Kemetic terms, then you're not going to come up with a strong argument. If you take Egyptian Arabic has Coptic words in it that can be traced to Medu Neter. Because in Egyptian Arabic, you have words like adobe. So the seasoning adobe.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll say that's an Arabic word, but of course that passed eventually into English. It's not an Arabic word. It's actually a Coptic word that comes from ancient Kemetic. See? So even when you go to this text here destroys Zahi Hawass's argument. Just this little bit here, because D. Father Benga demonstrates, say, words for let's take the word for the sun, for example. So page 114. So the Akkadian, which again Semitic, is Shamash. You have Berber, which is Tafukt, word for the sun. Ugaritic, which is another Semitic one, is Shapesh. Hebrew, Samesh, words for the sun. But ancient Kemetic, you have Ra. Coptic, Re, Re. It's not the same. And he does that with some other key terms, like the word for land. The word for land in Kemet is Ta. Nuer in Sudan is Thau. In the Republic of the Central African Republic, the Congo, you have To, word for land. You have, I will jump down because he has a bunch of terms here. In Nigeria, you have the Gema language, Uto. So you hear the Ta in there, means land, earth, country, region. The word, I'll do one more. The word for mouth in Akkadian is Pu. So the P is the basic consonant in Semitic languages for mouth. Hebrew, Pe. Arabic, Fam. Plural, Afam. So an F and a P are interchangeable, or cognates, if you will. But the word for mouth is Ra in Kemetic. So they're not related. Okay? And again, he does that throughout the text. Again, this was published in 1992 in English.
So when we see this invasion of the Arabs into Egypt around the 7th century, around that time frame, is there an adoption of is that where we get the adoption of Coptic words in Arabic to formulate what we know of now as Egyptian Arabic, or did this start to happen at a later time period?
So it will begin at the time of the invasion. Okay, not saying that it completely became Egyptian Arabic, because of course it takes time, but Egyptian Arabic comes into existence at and after 639, 640 AD. There's no such thing as Egyptian Arabic before 639.
So essentially, Zahi Hawass is he's really, I should say, fleecing the people by using particular terms, saying that it's closely related to Arabic and Hebrew, when both of these languages are two languages that are much later than Medu Neter. And instead of him primarily focusing on saying Egyptian Arabic by educating the people on the blending of Coptic and Arabic in the formulation of this Egyptian Arabic language, he's leading people to believe that essentially Arabic people who speak the Quranic Arabic have a closer relation to ancient Egypt than any of the indigenous African languages do.
Well, one thing you notice in their arguments is that they never deal with the 639, 640 Common Era Arabic invasion of Egypt. They know they because they're trying to claim that they were already there. Before that, they're trying to claim that they were there from the origin of say from Narmer, right?
And also many Egyptians, a lot of them will tell you that they're not Arabic.
Right.
So, I mean, they're not standing in front of you with a DNA test to show you their genetics, but they'll say that they're not Arabic. And in some cases, that's true. Some cases that is true. I mean, some of them, are not Arabic. Some of them are closely related to people in Aswan or in the southern part of Egypt. But looking at Zahi Hawass, and again, I don't want to go into the Greenberg method, but just in looking at Zahi Hawass and his phenotype, he looks more Arabic than Egyptian to me.
Well, what they've tried to do essentially is create a new people, Egyptian, that's separate from anything else, any other type of Arabic formations. That's basically what they want us to believe. When they're using the word Egyptian, it's like it's something that originated in that particular geographical area and not connected to the invasions. That's basically what they're trying to do.
Yeah, and Diop dealt with that, with that the whole red race hypothesis, or the Mediterranean race hypothesis. He deals with that. Again, these are old arguments that they're recycling them in hopes that we have forgotten. Right? There is no such thing as a Mediterranean race. No such thing as a red race. And so that's again, those are falsities, because they don't want to deal with these are African people. And even when you go into Kemet, when you go into the records of how they define themselves, okay, you even looking at directionality. So of course, many of you would know that the word for left is the same word for east. The word for right side is the same word for west. The word for north is the word for down, like downstream. The word for south is another word, is like is upper, Rashid, if you will. Because when you look at, let's say, a cross section, let's say from the side, land elevation. So if this is, let's say, the highlands of Ethiopia, and say up here is Mount Kilimanjaro, etc., the land elevation actually goes like this, down. So down here, this is sea level, and right here is the mountains and highlands. So it goes down. So this is why it's upper, and this is all lower, based on land elevation. But you have terms like Takui as referring to land south. Again, not my opinion. This is what's in the records. Takui, which means land of spirits. Okay. Now, Some may say, well, that might mean land of light. Again, I don't know, but Kui, or Akh, if you will, Akui, is a word that should be translated as ancestor. So when we go into text, like the Pertum Heru, or the book of going forth into the daylight, and one of the chapters that many will take from, they'll say, Nuk Pu Nuk Ku Am Imku. Again, I'm just using eschatology speak here. So E.A. Wallace Budge, who was the head of the British Antiquities from 1800s going into the early 1900s, in his translation of the Papyrus of Ani, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, he translated it as "I am that I am." It should not be translated as that. Again, going into the detail, it should say, "It is I. I am an ancestor who comes forth from the light in the limbs of nature," if you will. Here's the point. That word "ku" or "ak" is a word that should be translated as ancestor. Many of them were translated as like a light spirit or light being. Not understanding, again, just the detail that, we deal with on scholastic levels to demonstrate the relationship. So it is I am an ancestor who comes forth from, in the light, which makes sense because we're always associating ourselves with light. Like in Old Kingdom, I'm merging with the stars when I pass away. I'm merging with Ra. Makes sense. But the word Akh is also cognate in other African languages. See, ask people who speak Arabic and Hebrew, what is your word for spirit? This is where you got to take the conversation. What is your word for spirit? Okay. Now, one of our words, we have Ka, which is one word. We have Akh. Akh is the same in Yoruba. And we all know where Yoruba is spoken, right? Mm-hmm. Aiku is a word for referring to an ancestral person. Okay. Aiku. So that's in West Africa. We can go to the Congo. Okwe, that Obenga demonstrates within Bochi language, is a word for ancestor. Okwe. So you can hear this, the commonality. Let's not stop there. Let's go to Kenya. Let's go to the Kilinjan language. It's Aik, word for spirit, ancestor. Coptic, Ik, in Coptic. See, they have to deal with that because that shows. Now ask, okay, since, is grammatically the same or the closer, what is your word for spirit? Okay. What is your word? What is the common word you use for God, if you will? Okay. And then, if you go, for us is Necher. We know Necher, and Necher is all over Africa. In Ethiopia, there's a form, Naiteru. Naiteru, that's just one. There's like a whole list of languages spoken in Africa right now. The word Necher is there. And in some cases, it looks almost the same, has the same consonants. There's some variations. There's some dropping of consonants, of course, because that's natural over thousands of years. Necher is all over the place. And again, using this updated data from Mboli, we're able to figure these things out. Kemet is all over Africa. The word Kemet has to do with land with water flowing through it and vegetation growing around the river, and it's by extension, are creating civilization around that. What do you think is happening in the Congo? What do you think is happening in Uganda? All that is Kemet. So although, many, would be triggered by that, by the thinking, oh, it doesn't mean this, but wait a minute, look at what we found out. We strengthen the argument to demonstrate the Africanity of Kemet. Mm-hmm. Just by the words. Now, let's go to Saudi Arabia. Where's your Kemet? We got Kemet all over. We still keep these terms. Bantu languages technically are older than Kemetic by the research, because Bantu, watch this. Bantu is to spoken African languages as Medu Neter as to written African languages. Let's say it again. Bantu is to spoken African languages as Medu Neter is to written tradition. So you got the oral tradition, you got the written tradition. Mm. Both of them are highly conservative. Bantu is highly conservative in preserving its sounds. Medu Neter is highly conservative in conserving the written form. Okay? So when you merge these two, I mean, it's just genius work that our ancestors have done to keep ancestral memory alive. You know how they did it? They did it through the sounds. Come on with it. They did it through the sounds. And they did it through the writing. Let's take the word Hotep. Okay. Now, granted, I'm not saying there is no relationship with Semitic. Okay. I'll explain that in a sec. But it's more like a distant cousin, to the point where, yo, we're not even in the same house. You way over there. Okay. Because all languages on the planet come from Africa, right? Which means all the languages are related. But we in two different houses. Okay. You way over there, and y'all do stuff way differently than we do over here. So in this house, in African languages, let's take the word Hotep. So Coptic is Hotep. Okay. Hotep. You have the Hori letter that begins it. That starts at Hori, Oa, Te, and Pe. So that's how you spell it. Okay. So we know it's HTP, or the dotted H, T, and P as a consonants. A K sound is older than the H sound. When a K relaxes based on certain environmental stresses throughout history in human beings' interaction, a K can become an H. In Bantu, they still use the word. They say katapa. You hear it? They say katapa, and it means sacrifice, offering. Hotep means what? Sacrifice and offering. Same meaning. In Kenya, in Kilijan, again, this is one of the reasons why Greenberg, these models don't work, the Greenberg model, because Bantu is what? Niger Congo. Egyptian is Afro-Asiatic. Now, if I go to Kilijan, which is Nilo-Saharan, it's related to Kemetic, because they say Katepi, it means to rest. So when you go into an Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary, any one of them, you will find all the words where Hotep is used. HTP has different meanings. One of them is to sit and rest. Okay. These are three different language families based on Greenberg. Again, doesn't work. It's been dismantled by the work of many, including Kipchewit Sambo, who did the work on Kilijan. And if you take Kilijan, again, in Kenya, I mean, his work is amazing. Like, it almost matches like consonant for consonant with Kemetic. He has a whole like pages and pages of just lists of words demonstrating this. You can almost use Kilijan. I could use that to pronounce Kemetic. I could put them right next to each other. Like, it's mind blowing. Let me tell you this too. I'm trying to get in as much as possible in a short amount of time. What that great ancestor, Dr. John Henry Clark, he calls these people radical Europeans. Some of them knew this already. So many of you may have read the works or heard of the works of Gerald Massey. You heard of those works?
Yeah.
So now watch this. Gerald Massey, and again, he's from Britain, from England, right? Mm-hmm. So what's happening in the 1800s? You have the British Empire, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. You have the British who are bringing these artifacts from their pillage of the world and to their museums. So Gerald Massey has access to these things, okay? And he's just writing. If you look at any one of his books, one page out of one of his books, you could do a 20-page report off of one page. And his books is thick. I have some of them like way up there on the bookshelf. So his first set, his 2-volume set, A Book of the Beginnings, 1881. Second 2-volume set, 1883, The Natural Genesis. And then 1907, the year that he died, you had ancient Egypt, the light of the world. Okay. Watch this. In 1881, A Book of the Beginnings, Volume 2, he has a word list. This brings back. This is 1881. He has a word list comparing Egyptian with Xhosa and Zulu. Like, what are we talking about here? 1881. Now, granted, yeah, he may not have linguistic skill like that. May have been off, but I don't really think that's the point. What got in his head that made him say the best languages that I'm gonna spend my time with comparing Kemetic with like whole word list is Xhosa and Zulu. One whole chapter just doing that. Get that. A book, and if you or grab it off the shelf, A Book of the Beginnings, Volume 2. And I'm like, wait a minute. What? So some of these people knew this. Okay, now the perfection or rigor of his work on that part, I don't really think is important. Just the fact that you did that. See? So this is nothing new. They knew that many of them had known this, but they were not part of the mainstream because the mainstream was focused on the what? The biblical narrative.
And his student, Albert Churchward, took it even further with the anthropological evidence of the Africans in Kemet, pointing to Inner Africa as their origins.
Yeah, and he was a student. Albert Churchward was a student of Gerald Massey. Okay, so when I have conversations with some of the our Prince Hall brothers, which I like to call African Lodge Masons, which is what I really think we need to go back to that. African Lodge Masons. Okay, much honor to the great ancestor Prince Hall that get his work. Albert Churchward. Okay, and you go to Masonic libraries, you know, like the first one I've been to is right there in Philly, my hometown, at the Masonic Temple. So when you go in there, you can do tours if you want, but you go in, you go to Masonic library. They have, at least at the time, Albert Churchward. They had Schwaller de Lubitz works, etc. They know this. Albert Churchward, you know, was, you know, honest, like, hey, this stuff comes out of Africa, and here's why. Here's the Kemetic, boom, and here's, you know, the rituals, etc.
I want to take it. I want to circle back to what Zahi Hawass was saying. So we're running short on time, but here now, this is what he said later in this article, and you know, the reason why I wanted to point this out is because oftentimes, when you're using the logic of looking at reliefs and trying to determine the ethnicity of the ancient Egyptians, in many cases, a lot of Egyptologists, European Egyptologists, will try to negate many of the reliefs that have African features, and they'll even try to negate that logic or that methodology of looking at the relief and saying that this relief looks African, this relief looks Asiatic, this relief looks Indo-European or whatever. But here, Zahi Hawass is using this logic to try to separate the Egyptians, as he calls them, from the Nubians. And the reason that they always focus on the Nubians specifically is because they think phenotypically African Americans are closer to Nubians, or at least that's what they want people to believe, that African Americans are closer to Nubians. So they try to create this separation between the Ta-Nehisians and the Timerians or Ramesh, people of Kemet. And in doing so, they try to point to specific time periods where they would say the Nubians ruled like the 25th dynasty. This is always Zahi Hawass's argument. So here he says the scenes depicted on the ancient Egyptian temples all show the pharaohs smiting the enemies of Egypt among the peoples of the countries of the regions such as Nubia, Libya, and Mesopotamia. Now, I made an error earlier when I was referencing this statement. I think I said Mediterranean, but he says here Mesopotamia.
Okay.
Look at their faces, and you can notice the difference between the ancient Egyptians and these other peoples. Now, I don't have the picture that he's referencing. I could pull it up, but I don't have it in this presentation. But using this logic, if we were to, let's say, look at the face of Narmer. All right, so we're talking about the first dynasty. Phenotypically, if we use Zahi Hawass's logic, we can look at Narmer's phenotype and clearly see distinctive African features.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Zahi Hawass will reference, as he did in previous statements, the upper part of Egypt or the southern part of Egypt as having more dark-skinned people. All right. When we look at where Narmer came from, he came from the southern part of Egypt in a place called Nikan. All right. Now we look at the first dynasty that people give the date 3100 BCE to, and in some cases this is questionable, based around the fact that many Egyptologists have given different dates. If you go to Robin Walker's work, When We Ruled, he discusses this in his work. He talks about Egyptian chronology. So I know recently they have done more definite dating around carbon dating and such to try to show that the first dynasty was around 3100 BCE. But if we go back to the Kemetic scholar, or who our ancestors called Mene Jehudi, who the Greeks called Manetho, he proposed a date of 5717 for the first dynasty.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's just a comparison versus the other Egyptologists that you see in the list here, like Breasted, Petrie, Lesbius, Champollion, etc. But when we look back at the palette of Narmer, now this is using Zahi Hawass's logic, and we look at here, he is smiting what Zahi Hawass would consider to be an enemy. Look at the phenotype of Narmer, okay? And look at the phenotype of the enemy that he's smiting. Now, in Civilization of Barbarism, Jacques, when he talks about this palette, I believe maybe referring to this in also in the both times he refers to it in the African Origins of Civilization, Myth, and Reality.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about on one side of the palette showing or depicting Nubians, and on the other side of the palette depicting Asiatics. Some people debate this, but here on this side of the palette, many Egyptologists will say that Narmer is subduing a Nubian. Well, if I look at the Nubian's face and I look at Narmer's face using Zahi Hawass's logic, they look similar to me. Now, if we look at who they call Scorpion or Selk or Weha, who in some cases, when people talk about Narmer unifying upper and lower Kemet, they often try to say that Selk, or some people try to believe that Selk was a foreigner or that he was Asiatic of some sort. But Selk was from the same region that Narmer was from. In fact, he ruled in Upper Kemet before Narmer gained control and took power and unified both the North and the South. So Selk was known as the unifier of Upper Kemet or the South prior to Narmer opening up the first dynasty. But we can look at also, if we wanted to use the logic of Zahi Hawass, going back to, this would be considered pre-dynastic Kemet or pre-dynastic Egypt. We could look at the phenotype of Selk and also see that he has African features. If we keep going, we can go to Horden's. This is a sandal label that was found on the sandal of Horden also from the first dynasty. Here he's supposedly smiting an Asiatic. So there's a text on the Palermo stone that talks about, or it's been translated to reflect him smiting a Bedouin, which would be considered somebody from the East, essentially an Arab. So people would say that he's smiting Asiatic here. But if we look closely at also his phenotype, we can clearly see the distinctive African features. So we look at the historical factor, linguistic factor, and psychological factors, and we combine all of these factors. We have multiple factors that point to ancient Kemet specifically not being an Arabic civilization, as
because
many modern day Egyptian Arabs will want you to believe.
Yeah, they would have called them Shasu. Okay. They were smiting them, not being ruled by them in pre-dynastic time, pre-dynastic and dynastic times. They would have considered them outsiders.
Another one of my favorite pictures is this picture of Hesi-Ra. This is in the Old Kingdom. And you can see Hesi-Ra, who has these circles here, this here, okay? That this is designating the kinks in his hair. So distinctively, when you look at the African, one thing that's distinctive of the African from all the people on the planet is the texture of the African hair. And people will try to say that, these were wigs and all these different things. Not in all the cases. They were wigs in some cases, but not in all cases. And you have to think about this. If they were wigs and they're patterning the hair texture in these wigs after African hair, then that means that they're trying to emulate the natural hair that they have.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
Oh, and can I point something else too to help support you? So when we're looking at images, and they'll say, yeah, you have the red and then the yellow of the women, that means they're light skinned, etc. No, that is a convention that's still practiced by Bantu people. Okay, where they would use yellow ochre to paint their bodies. Okay, and red ochre for the men. Okay, and even with the red, even in East Africa, they still do it today. So that's yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Let's take that to the bank.
Another picture that they rarely ever talk about, or another king that they rarely ever talk about too, is Sahura, the 5th dynasty. And I think you can clearly see why. Sahura, as we can clearly see, is an African. This is one of the images that was used on the cover of one of the versions of George M. James' book, The Stolen Legacy. And it's funny, even in the Cairo Museum, many of the African statues that have African features of the kings, prominent kings, like Nima Atra, Menehet III, Mentuhotep, many of these are on a side display and not put in a prominent place in the museum for the multiple visitors or tourists to see. Because in often cases, what they're doing is they're catering tourism in Egypt to Europeans and Asians, because these are the people that come there the most and spend the most money. And because the revenue from tourism has dropped dramatically since the revolution, it's not hard to understand why this attack, primarily coming from people like Zahi Hawass and other Arab Egyptians, is taking place. Because if more people started to actually understand the true history of ancient Kemet, a lot of Europeans would not travel there, which would really take, tourism and the revenue from tourism. So they have to protect the idea that African people had nothing to do with ancient Kemet. But when we look at Sahura, he was one of the first kings to actually send a ship to the Levant region to bring back cedar wood. So we're talking about one of the earliest establishers of a naval force, so to speak, in ancient Egypt. And this is one of the depictions from relief that was found in his temple uh, near his pyramid in Abu Sir. And here you can see these Africans that are actually sailing on this ship here. Some of the paint has been removed, but if you look at the 3D models that are inside of the Cairo Museum, and you can see a replication, not specifically of Sahura's expedition, but you can see Africans that are sailing here on this ship. Okay, these are not people that are, according to Zahi Hawass's logic, a representation of your modern day, everyday Arab Egyptian. So I just wanted to add those pictures in there to give people a visual representation, along with the vast amount of knowledge, brother, that you dropped on the linguistic evidence and analysis, so that the people can understand that in a lot of cases, Egyptologists are very selective on what time periods they cover in ancient Kemet. They're very selective on what evidence they present when they're doing many of these presentations, and also very selective on when they do go in and do things such as DNA research. When they go in and look at genetics, they're very selective on which mummies they use for that research, which areas of Egypt they choose to focus on to present the DNA evidence. And this is evident in one of the more recent genetic studies that was done, where they tried to say that the ancient Egyptians were more closely related to Middle Eastern people and Europeans, based upon a DNA study that they did from the Ptolemaic period back to the New Kingdom.
Do you mind if I add something to support you? Because you reminded me of something.
Sure, go
ahead. So just you speaking about the great ancestor, the King Sahura, and him going to the Levant, Palestine area to get cedar wood. It reminded me of when you go into what they call the New Kingdom and what's called the Report of Wenamun. So this is the Papyrus Moscow 120, the Moscow Papyrus Catalog number 120. So if you go into Ancient Egyptian Literature, Volume 2 by Miriam Latham, and the Report of Wenamun. So Wenamun went on an expedition to the Levant to get cedar wood to use for the sacred boat and bark of Amun, and also to, because we use that cedar wood to make the boats, and also to make the shrines, the sacred shrines.
Mm-hmm.
So he goes there and he's basically speaking to the ruler there, like, yo, listen, you need to, give us some of the cedar wood, because I'm an envoy from Kemet. So they're having a light debate.
Mm-hmm.
Watch this, because this is the point I want to bring up, that these people who say that Egyptian civilization comes from outside, but the view from the ancient people, I'm not even talking about Greeks, I'm about Semitic speakers, recognize the origin of Kemet, meaning that Kemet came before them, not the other way around. Let's go. So they're having a conversation, and the ruler says to Wenamun, he says, indeed, Amun has founded all the lands. He founded them after having first founded the land of Egypt, from which you come from. Thus, craftsmanship came from it in order to reach the place where I am. Thus, learning came from it in order to reach the place where I am. Let's stop there. So here you have a ruler in the Levant recognizing the anteriority and antiquity of Kemet, saying to Wenderman, and mind you, he's a ruler, so he's educated. He's saying that craftsmanship, learning, y'all taught us this. The idea of deity comes from your land to here. This is on the record. So if we're having these conversations, this is why it's important. Read Kemetic literature. It's tons of it. The records demonstrate and support. So, Brother Amos, you're showing the images. You're showing archaeological. These are artifacts, which is supported by the literature. So I wanted to point to that. Right. That reminded me with that cedarwood.
Dua, brother. We appreciate you for joining us, and we definitely have to have you do a part 2 to go in and give more detailed comparisons that you started to go into when you would, discussing the various different languages. So we definitely have to have you back for that. And anything that you want to share with the listeners, or how they can get in contact with you, your work. Most people already know you, but for anybody that doesn't, any information that you want to share with those listeners.
You have my email. If you can share that, Sonjedi Ankh-Ra @gmail.com, so you can email me. My website is currently being constructed as we speak, so that's forthcoming. Of course, some people have me on Facebook as Scribe Sonjedi or Sonjedi Ankh-Ra. So for right now, that's the best contact. Until I get my website fully up and running. And so yes, so I teach classes right now. I'm finishing up a class now at Medu Neter. Another one next month, more like a second level in nouns. And that's for people who've already taken level 1. So that's open. And then in the fall, I'll do another level 1. And that's under the Institute of Kemetic Philology, of course, headed by Sebat Riketi Amen. We also have Seba Banachi as well. So they're the 2 elder teachers of the institution. So we have myself and some others who are teachers under them. So.
Yeah, we definitely appreciate you, brother. I mean, that's the extraordinary knowledge, and it just shows the importance of actually doing what Sheikh Anta asked us to do, and that is to become specialists in various areas, of our history, because he said that he had to do everything. Yeah. He had to do the linguistics. He had to do the history. He had to do the psychology. He had to do everything, and he implored us to become specialists. And that's what brothers like yourself, brother Imhotep, brother Amos have done. And this is the whole purpose of this. There's only one purpose for this, and that is to move our people towards Abiba Fodier, towards African liberation and empowerment, in order to restore us to our original position on the planet as free, proud, productive, prosperous, and powerful people. And that only comes through power. That's the only way that it can happen. And the cultural revolution, psychological warfare, or intellectual warfare, as Dr. Carruthers called it, is critically important. And that's what you are doing. Please provide, if Almost doesn't already have it, a list of those books so that we can post those. We want to make sure that the books are posted, even the ones that are in French, because a lot of our people can read French. One of my good friends is a native of Senegal, a Wolof brother from Senegal. I can always go to him and say, "Hey, translate this for me." So we definitely need the list of books there that your brother Amos and I published a study guide a couple of years ago, and we probably need to update it. So definitely do that, and we'll look forward, to seeing you when you return.
Yes, sir. Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity. you know, allowing me to share, you know, just a little bit that I got, you know, and, you know, listening to your wisdom and direction, you know, Brother Amos, you know, your wisdom, your direction, your knowledge, you know, on the topic, you know, very, very complimentary. You know, you're showing the images, et cetera, and very, you know, very concise points, you know, that people got to get in their minds, you know. So, and let's you know, let's keep it going. Do another collaboration. Maybe we could do a collaboration presentation. You know, um, you know, let's just keep working. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Definitely.
Right.
All right, well, brothers and sisters, if you like this video, definitely share it with your friends. Leave a comment down in the comment section. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Also, click the like button to help us with the YouTube algorithm to get this out there. And until next time, be before Hodie.
Be before Hodie.
Be before the